Frau Hauptmann Helene Richter stared at the steaming bowl of spotted dick on her tray as if it were a personal insult. A graduate of Munich's prestigious Hotel Management Institute, a woman who'd supervised kitchens for Wehrmacht officers across occupied Belgium, she now faced what she considered the ultimate proof of British culinary depravity. A dense, suet-laden cylinder studded with currants, drowning in custard, served like something respectable. The October rain hammered against the windows of Camp 18, Featherstone Park's mess hall, casting grey light on what Helene viewed as gastronomic tragedy. Around her, 45 German women prisoners sat in various states of confusion and revulsion. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were administrators who'd managed military supply chains, radio operators who'd coordinated communications across 3 countries, nurses who'd worked in field hospitals from Normandy to the Ardennes. Many came from educated families, raised in a culture that viewed German desserts as the pinnacle of European refinement. "Ladies," Helene announced in crisp German, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This is what happens when a nation mistakes lard for butter and calls it civilization. They feed educated women like we are boarding school children." She gestured at the pudding with barely concealed contempt. The cylinder sat in its pool of yellow custard, dark and heavy, studded with what appeared to be dried fruit that had been boiled into submission. To Helene's trained eye, it looked like something assembled without understanding the fundamental principles of proper pastry work. The name alone, Spotted Dick, suggested a people who'd given up on culinary dignity entirely. Beside her, Oberleutnant Greta Hoffmann, a former logistics coordinator from Hamburg, nodded in agreement. "In Germany, we would make proper Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, Apfelstrudel with technique. This looks like something from a workhouse kitchen, not a proper establishment." Sergeant Major Dorothy Pemberton, the British mess supervisor, stood near the serving line, watching the German women's reactions with an expression of patient forbearance. She was a stout woman in her late 40s, with the kind of practical competence that suggested she'd managed difficult situations before. Her uniform was impeccable, despite the damp Northumberland weather, and her eyes held something that looked like quiet amusement. "Ladies," Pemberton said in careful, deliberate English, "I understand this is different from what you're accustomed to, but I encourage you to try it before passing judgment. British puddings have been comforting families through hardship for generations." Helene understood enough English to catch the meaning, though she pretended otherwise. She turned to the younger women at her table. Nurse Liesel Braun, radio operator Anneliese Koch, and administrative clerk Frieda Schulz, and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "The British think if they feed us enough stodge, we will forget that we are prisoners. They do not understand that some of us have standards that cannot be compromised by excessive portions of boiled suet." Several women laughed at this observation, emboldened by Helene's leadership. Since arriving at Camp 18 6 weeks earlier, Helene had become the unofficial voice of the German women, the one who articulated their shared sense of displacement and cultural superiority. It was a role she'd fallen into naturally, built on her professional credentials and her inability to accept that defeat might mean learning from the victors. The mess hall buzzed with German conversations, women comparing this latest dessert to what they had eaten back home. Some discussed the delicate Linzer torte they missed, others the proper Bienenstich their grandmothers had made. Several reminisced about peacetime Christmas stollen that seemed like distant dreams now. Helene pushed the pudding to the edge of her tray, focusing instead on the other items: roasted vegetables that were adequately prepared, shepherd's pie that was passable though lacking proper seasoning, and tea that reminded her why Germans preferred coffee. She ate methodically, maintaining the posture and precision that had been drilled into her during her hospitality training. Across the hall, she noticed that a few of the younger German women were actually attempting to eat the pudding. Anneliese Koch, sitting 3 tables away, had taken a small spoonful and was chewing with an expression that looked suspiciously like surprise rather than disgust. This troubled Helene. If the younger prisoners started accepting British food without resistance, it would undermine the cultural solidarity she'd been trying to maintain. "Anneliese," Helene called out in German, her voice sharp enough to cut through the dining hall chatter. "You are actually eating that abomination!" The young radio operator looked up, caught between embarrassment and defiance. At 24, she was nearly 15 years younger than Helene, and clearly intimidated by the older woman's authority. "It is not as terrible as it appears, Frau Hauptmann. Different, yes, but warm and filling. The custard is actually quite pleasant." "Pleasant custard does not excuse primitive technique," Helene replied coldly. "A properly trained pastry chef would never produce something so dense and heavy. It is wasteful and unsophisticated." But even as she spoke, Helene caught the aroma drifting from Anneliese's table. Warm spices with notes of cinnamon and nutmeg, the richness of vanilla custard, the yeasty comfort of steamed dough. Her stomach responded with an involuntary flutter of interest that she quickly suppressed. She had not survived 14 years in professional hospitality by letting base hunger override her refined judgment. As the meal concluded and the women filed out into the cold Northumberland afternoon, Helene overheard fragments of conversation that disturbed her carefully maintained narrative. Some of the younger prisoners were discussing the pudding with something approaching appreciation. A few admitted they had enjoyed it. One even suggested it reminded her of her grandmother's damp fnoodle, though coarser. That evening, lying in her bunk in the women's barracks, Helene found herself troubled by thoughts she didn't want to entertain. The pudding had been objectively well prepared, properly steamed, the suet properly incorporated, the custard smooth without being thin. These were technical achievements she would have praised in a German kitchen, but admitting that the British understood anything about desserts would mean acknowledging that perhaps her assumptions about British culinary inferiority were built on prejudice rather than truth. The question haunted her in the darkness. If she was wrong about British pudding, what else might she be wrong about? The thought was more terrifying than captivity itself, because it suggested that everything she'd believed about German cultural superiority, everything that had given her identity meaning during the chaos of war and defeat, might be nothing more than comfortable lies. But 4 days later, something would happen in the camp kitchen that would force Helene to confront an uncomfortable truth. What if everything she'd learned about sophisticated desserts in Munich had blinded her to a different kind of wisdom? What if the British, with their simple ingredients and straightforward methods, understood something about food that German complexity had missed? The transformation began not with surrender, but with a single reluctant spoonful that would change everything she believed about cooking, culture, and the enemy who had defeated her nation. The following morning brought another confrontation with the offensive British food. Helene descended from her bunk with the rigid posture of someone determined to maintain standards in barbaric circumstances. The barracks were already stirring. 45 women preparing for another day of captivity, another day of navigating the strange customs of their captors. Breakfast at Camp 18 proved to be yet another assault on German sensibilities. Alongside porridge that Helene grudgingly admitted was well prepared, the British served what they called bread and butter pudding. Yesterday's bread soaked in custard, baked with raisins. It was thrift cooking, Helene thought, born of wartime necessity, but lacking proper technique. "Frau Hauptmann," said Greta Hoffmann quietly, sitting beside Helene at their usual table. "I tried the spotted dick yesterday evening at supper. You should taste it before continuing to judge." Helene turned sharply to face her friend, betrayal stinging more than the words themselves. "You, Greta! You have forgotten your training." "I have forgotten nothing," Greta replied calmly. "But I'm also remembering something my father once told me. That hunger is a harsh teacher, and pride makes bitter accompaniment. The pudding was actually quite good. Not German, certainly, but good in its own way." Around the mess hall, similar conversations were unfolding. The younger women, less attached to rigid food prejudices or perhaps simply more adaptable, had begun tentatively embracing British cuisine. Their reactions suggested that the food wasn't quite the culinary disaster Helene had proclaimed. Nurse Liesl Braun was teaching others at her table to request extra custard with their pudding, creating small variations that personalised the experience. Radio operator Annalisa Koch had discovered that the British made different types: treacle pudding, jam roly-poly, Sussex pond pudding, variations that suggested more sophistication than Helene had credited. "This is betrayal of our culture," Helene muttered, pushing her bread pudding around her bowl. "This is survival," Greta countered gently. "We are prisoners in a foreign land. The war is lost, Helene. Must we also lose our ability to adapt?" The words hit harder than intended. Helene had spent the weeks since capture clinging to the belief that maintaining German standards was a form of resistance, a way of proving that defeat hadn't broken their spirit. But watching the other women gradually accept British hospitality, she began to wonder if her resistance was actually strength or simply stubbornness masquerading as principle. That afternoon, during the daily orientation session, Captain Margaret Thornhill addressed the food situation with unusual directness. She was a crisp woman in her early 50s who commanded respect through quiet authority rather than volume. "Ladies," Thornhill began in careful German that suggested military language training, "I understand many of you find British cuisine unfamiliar. In Germany, dessert traditions emphasize layers and precision. Here in Britain, particularly in the north, we value comfort, warmth, and honest ingredients. Neither approach is superior. They are simply different expressions of the same goal, feeding people well." She gestured to photographs of British working families. "This nation has endured 6 years of rationing. Spotted dick, bread pudding, jam roly-poly. These aren't primitive foods. They're clever responses to scarcity. They take simple ingredients, flour, suet, dried fruit, and transform them into something that brings comfort and joy. Your German tradition of Torte does something similar with different techniques. Same principle. Respect the ingredients, bring happiness through food." Helene wanted to object, to argue that German dessert's complexity represented higher cultural achievement, but the words stuck in her throat. Thornhill's explanation made uncomfortable sense, suggesting that perhaps British puddings weren't evidence of ignorance, but rather a different kind of wisdom. After the session, Sergeant Major Pemberton approached Helene directly. "Frau Hauptmann Richter, I understand you managed hospitality operations in Belgium." "Yes," Helene replied stiffly in English. "For 3 years." "Then you understand kitchen operations, proper preparation, the importance of technique." Pemberton paused, measuring her words carefully. "I'd like to invite you to visit our kitchen tomorrow morning, not to cook, just to observe how we prepare our puddings. Maybe you'll understand them better if you see the process." The invitation was clever, Helene recognized, appealing to her professional curiosity, while offering a face-saving way to learn about the despised food. It suggested Pemberton understood that Helene's resistance came from pride rather than genuine disgust. "I will come," Helene said finally, "but I make no promises about changing my opinion." "Fair enough, ma'am. Fair enough." That evening, Helene lay in her bunk, listening to the other women discuss the day's developments. The conversation had shifted dramatically from mockery to cautious appreciation and even some enthusiasm. "The treacle pudding at dinner was wonderful," admitted someone from across the barracks. "I asked for seconds," confessed another voice, barely audible. The matron seemed pleased. "Has anyone else noticed the British are feeding us better than we ate in Germany for the last 2 years?" asked Frieda Schultz from the bunk below Helene's. "After months of turnip soup and sawdust bread, these puddings are substantial." Helene touched her own waist, feeling the small but noticeable difference that 6 weeks of British food had created. She'd been dangerously thin when captured, as most German civilians were by the war's end. The abundant British meals, even the despised puddings, were restoring her health, whether she admitted it or not. The question now wasn't whether British food was adequate. Clearly it was. The real question was whether her pride would prevent her from admitting that these supposedly backward British might understand something about cuisine that sophisticated Germans had overlooked. Through the barracks window, she could see the camp kitchen, where steam rose from vents even at this late hour. Tomorrow, Sergeant Major Pemberton would show her the pudding preparation process, and Helene would be forced to evaluate British cooking with professional honesty rather than patriotic prejudice. The thought both intrigued and terrified her. What if the British really did know what they were doing? What if their simple, direct approach to desserts represented not ignorance, but clarity? What if she'd been wrong? Sleep came slowly that night, troubled by questions that challenged everything she'd built her identity around. In the darkness, she could still smell the ghost of that pudding aroma, warm spices, vanilla custard, comforting starch, and her traitorous stomach rumbled its interest, despite her mind's resistance. Sunday's demonstration loomed 4 days away, and Helene sensed that something significant would happen there, something that would force her to choose between comfortable prejudice and uncomfortable truth. The British were planning something special. She'd heard talk of an outdoor event where they'd demonstrate what they called traditional northern pudding making. Part of her wanted to refuse to attend, to maintain her resistance through absence, but a deeper, more honest part of her professional soul whispered that she needed to see this. Needed to understand what these British were doing with their simple ingredients and straightforward techniques, needed to know if her contempt was justified or if she'd been blind to a different kind of culinary excellence all along. The answer would come soon enough, served warm with custard, challenging every assumption she'd carried into captivity. And Helene suspected, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, that she wasn't ready for the lesson that awaited her. The kitchen at dawn proved to be a revelation. Helene had expected a utilitarian space focused on efficiency over quality, perhaps staffed by untrained cooks who followed recipes without understanding principles. Instead, she found herself standing in a well-organized facility that would have impressed even her exacting mother, who'd managed the kitchen staff at a grand hotel in Stuttgart before the war. "Welcome to my domain," Sergeant Major Pemberton said with obvious pride, gesturing around the spotless kitchen. The morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating copper pots that gleamed from meticulous care. "We prepare 3 meals daily for 380 people. Everything's made properly, following recipes that have sustained British families for generations." Helene studied the setup with her professional eye. Large steamers arranged for optimal workflow. Multiple preparation stations organized by function. Ingredient storage that followed proper rotation principles. The organization spoke of someone who understood not just cooking, but kitchen management at a sophisticated level. "This is impressive," Helene admitted reluctantly. "Thank you, Mum," Pemberton replied. "Now let me show you how we prepare proper spotted dick." Pemberton moved to a large work table and assembled her ingredients. "This is fresh suet from the butcher, delivered this morning. Plain flour, sugar, currants, breadcrumbs for texture, milk, a bit of baking powder. Simple ingredients, but the technique matters." She began grating the suet with practiced efficiency. Her movements were economical, precise. Helene watched the technique, the way Pemberton kept the suet cold, worked quickly to prevent melting. It was skill, real skill, not the mindless food preparation Helene had assumed British cooks practiced. "In Germany," Helene said slowly, "we use butter for our desserts. We add eggs, cream, layers of flavor. We build complexity." "And those are lovely," Pemberton replied, without defensiveness. "But steamed puddings follow a different philosophy. Take simple ingredients, treat them properly, create something that comforts and sustains. It's about honesty, not ornamentation." The words struck Helene with unexpected force. She'd spent years learning to build elaborate desserts, to construct complex cakes where technique obscured the base ingredients. The idea that simplicity might be its own form of sophistication had never occurred to her. Pemberton mixed the grated suet with flour, sugar, and breadcrumbs. Common mistake is working the mixture too much. You want to combine it just enough, keep it light. Add the currants, then the milk gradually. The consistency should be soft but not wet. She demonstrated, creating a dough that held together without being dense. Helene leaned closer, fascinated. This wasn't crude food preparation, this was craft. The name confuses people, Pemberton continued, shaping the mixture into a cylinder. Spotted Dick? It's actually spotted dog, corrupted over time. The spots are currants, but I'll grant you, the name doesn't help its reputation. She wrapped the pudding in a cloth that had been soaked and floured, tying the ends securely. The cloth allows it to expand while steaming, 2 hours in boiling water, low, steady heat. That's the secret. Patience. Pemberton placed the wrapped pudding in a large steamer. The gentle hiss of steam filled the kitchen. While this cooks, let me show you something interesting. She pulled out a worn cookbook, pages stained and marked. This belonged to my grandmother. Look at this recipe. It's from 1910. Spotted Dick, Sussex pudding. Jam roly-poly, these recipes survived 2 wars, the Depression, rationing. You know why? Because they work. They take ingredients people can get, flour, suet, dried fruit, and make something that brings joy. Helene looked at the handwritten notes in the margins. Your grandmother made these? For 60 years, through the Great War, through hard times, she said pudding was love you could taste, not fancy, but honest. Pemberton closed the book carefully. German desserts are art. British puddings are comfort. Both have value. While the pudding steamed, Pemberton prepared custard with equal attention. She heated milk slowly, tempering eggs, adding vanilla and sugar. Her technique was flawless. The custard thickened to perfect consistency without curdling. The custard matters as much as the pudding, Pemberton explained. Too thin, and it's just sweet milk. Too thick, and it overwhelms. This texture, it should coat the back of a spoon, but still pour smoothly. Helene found herself nodding, drawn in despite her resistance. This was cooking. Real cooking, stripped of pretension, but no less skilled for its simplicity. 2 hours later, Pemberton unwrapped the steamed pudding. The aroma that escaped made Helene's carefully maintained composure waver. Warm spices, dried fruit, the yeasty richness of properly steamed dough. The pudding had expanded perfectly, its surface smooth, the texture promising. Pemberton sliced the pudding with practiced confidence. The interior showed even distribution of currants, proper density that suggested correct steaming. She plated a generous portion, covered it with warm custard, and handed it to Helene with a challenge in her eyes. Judge it as a professional, ma'am, not as a German who's been told British food is inferior. Evaluate the technique, the execution, the respect for ingredients. Helene stared at the pudding on her plate, perfectly presented, steam still rising, custard pooling around the base. Every instinct told her to refuse on principle, but her professional curiosity demanded honest evaluation. The spotted dick felt warm through the plate, substantial in a way that spoke to proper preparation. Heat radiated upward, and the aroma enveloped her. Cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, the comfort of simple starches transformed through patient cooking. She lifted her spoon slowly, aware that Sergeant Major Pemberton was watching, aware that this moment carried weight beyond simple eating. This was about whether pride could survive contact with honest evaluation. The first bite surprised her with its depth. The texture came first, the tender give of properly steamed pudding, the slight chew of currants, the smooth richness of custard, all combining to create comfort in physical form. Then the flavours, subtle sweetness of the dough, brightness of dried fruit, warmth of spices, mellow vanilla binding everything together. It was, objectively speaking, delicious. Helene chewed slowly, her trained palate analysing every element, while her mind struggled to reconcile what she was tasting with what she'd believed. The pudding was perfectly executed, proper steaming that provided tender texture without sogginess. correct suet ratio that gave richness without greasiness, spicing that enhanced without overwhelming. This wasn't crude food. This was the result of understanding ingredients, respecting tradition, and executing with precision. It was everything good cooking should be, just expressed through a different culinary vocabulary than the one she'd been taught to value. "Well?" Pemberton asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Helene swallowed, struggling to find words that would acknowledge truth without completely surrendering her sense of identity. "It is—" She paused, the German part of her mind screaming betrayal. "It is actually quite good. Different from German preparations, but good. Very good." The admission felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders, even as another heaviness settled in, recognizing how much she'd been wrong about, how much her prejudice had blinded her. Pemberton smiled genuinely. "Ma'am, I think you just learned something important about keeping an open mind." Helene took another bite, this time without internal resistance, allowing herself to simply experience the food. It was even better the second time. The flavors seemed to develop and change as she chewed, the spice notes giving way to fruit sweetness, the custard providing creamy foundation, the pudding itself offering that essential comfort that made sense on a cold Northumberland morning. "The technique is sound," Helene said, falling back on professional language. "The steaming, the suet handling, the custard preparation, all properly executed. The ingredients are quality, the proportions balanced. This is skilled cooking, just in a style I was not trained to appreciate." "That's all it ever was," Pemberton replied. "Not better or worse than German baking, just different. Both our nations understand that food should bring comfort. We just express it differently." The connection startled Helene. She'd been so busy dismissing British food as inferior that she'd never considered it might serve the same emotional purpose as German desserts, just through different means. She finished the first portion and found herself eyeing the remaining pudding on the cutting board. The realization that she wanted more, that she was genuinely hungry for this food she'd been mocking, felt like a fundamental shift. "May I?" she asked, gesturing at the pudding. "Please," Pemberton encouraged. As Helene ate the second portion, she found herself thinking about everything else she might have been wrong about. If her assumptions about British food were this mistaken, what about her assumptions about British culture more broadly, about the people who had defeated Germany? About the society that could feed its prisoners better than Germany had fed its own citizens in the final years? The thoughts were uncomfortable, threatening the entire structure of belief she'd used to make sense of her world. But they were also oddly liberating, suggesting that perhaps defeat didn't mean the end of everything, but rather an opportunity to learn things that German victory would have prevented her from understanding. "Sergeant Major Pemberton," Helene said slowly, "I owe you an apology. I judged without knowledge, criticized without understanding. As a professional, I should have known better." Pemberton waved off the apology. "What matters is being willing to change your mind when evidence contradicts belief. That takes courage, that does." The two women stood in the quiet kitchen, morning sun fully illuminating the space, smell of steamed pudding lingering. Helene felt something shift inside her, some rigid structure of belief beginning to crack and rearrange into more flexible form. "I need to tell the other women," Helene said suddenly. "They look to me for guidance, and I have been guiding them poorly." "You'll have your chance on Sunday," Pemberton replied with a knowing smile. "Captain Thornhill approved my request for a demonstration. I was hoping you might help me present it, maybe explain what you've learned about the techniques involved." The invitation would transform her from opponent to advocate, use her authority to break down the resistance she'd helped create. It would force her to publicly admit she'd been wrong, to stand before the women who'd followed her lead and tell them that the British food they'd been mocking deserved their respect. The prospect terrified her, but it also felt necessary. Word spread through Camp 18 with peculiar speed. By lunchtime, every German woman knew that Frau Hauptmann Helene Richter had not only tried spotted dick, but had returned from the kitchen, praising Sergeant Major Pemberton's technique. The dining hall buzzed with German conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Helene entered. She could feel the eyes on her, the mixture of curiosity, betrayal, and cautious hope. She took her usual seat, but the dynamic had changed. She was no longer the unquestioned voice of German superiority, but something more complicated. Someone who'd crossed a line and returned, changed. "Helene," Greta Hoffmann said quietly, sliding into the seat beside her. "The women are confused. They need to understand what happened this morning." Helene looked at her tray. Today's lunch included treacle pudding, and this time she didn't push it aside. Instead, she picked up her spoon deliberately, aware that dozens of eyes watched. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded with professional approval. "What happened," Helene said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "is that I stopped letting pride interfere with honest evaluation. I watched Sergeant Major Pemberton prepare spotted dick with proper technique, quality ingredients, and genuine skill. I tasted the result with an open mind, and I discovered that I had been wrong." The hall had gone quiet, women straining to hear this unprecedented admission. "I was wrong," Helene repeated, the words coming easier. "I judged British puddings without understanding them, dismissed food I refused to taste. As a professional, this was inexcusable. I'm telling you now, British puddings, when properly prepared, are genuinely good food. Different from what we know, yes, but good." Nurse Liesel Braun spoke up from a nearby table, her voice tentative. "So we are permitted to enjoy them without feeling we are betraying our culture." "You are encouraged," Helene replied firmly. "Appreciating good food from another culture doesn't diminish our heritage. It demonstrates that we are educated enough to recognize quality wherever we find it." The atmosphere shifted palpably. Women who'd been eating their puddings with guilty secrecy now did so openly. Others who'd been resisting picked up the food they'd been avoiding and took exploratory bites. Permission had been granted to stop fighting a battle that had made no sense to many of them. The next 3 days passed in curious transition. Helene found herself spending more time in the kitchen, learning British techniques. Pemberton taught her about different regional puddings: Yorkshire Parkin, Manchester pudding, Eton mess. In return, Helena began teaching Pemberton some German techniques, demonstrating proper strudel dough and Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte construction. "This is remarkable," Pemberton said, tasting the apple strudel. "Paper-thin pastry. I've never managed that. It's like reaching the same destination by completely different roads. Your strudel uses stretched dough for delicacy. Our puddings use suet for richness. Both work, just different philosophies." The exchange felt significant. Like something being built between former enemies that transcended the war. Food was becoming a bridge where politics had constructed walls. But that evening, a letter arrived through Red Cross channels that shattered Helene's growing equilibrium. Her younger brother, Klaus, wrote from Cologne in handwriting that trembled with desperation. "Helene, we are starving. The ration cards buy almost nothing. Yesterday, 200 grams of bread that was more sawdust than wheat, no butter, no sugar for 6 weeks. Father grows weaker daily. The children cry from hunger at night. I do not begrudge you eating well. You are a prisoner. You deserve decent treatment. But I cannot pretend the contrast doesn't tear at me. I pray you are safe, and that someday we will share a proper meal again." Helene read the letter twice, 3 times, each reading making the contrast more devastating. She was a prisoner eating better than free German civilians. She'd gained weight while her family starved. She'd been arguing about pudding quality while her father weakened from malnutrition. She sat on her bunk, the letter trembling in her hands, and felt something break inside her. All her concerns about culinary sophistication suddenly seemed obscenely trivial. Her brother needed food, any food, and would have wept with gratitude for the puddings she'd been mocking. Greta found her there an hour later, still holding the letter. Without a word, Greta read what Klaus had written, then sat beside Helene in heavy silence. "The British feed prisoners like honoured guests, while German civilians starve," Helene said bitterly. A world where the victors determine who eats, Greta replied quietly. But also a world where that says something important about which side deserved to win. That the British treat even their enemies better than our government treated its own people. That tells you something about the systems we were supporting. I need to help them, Helene said. Klaus, my father, the children, they need to come here. Then prove you've adapted successfully, Greta advised. Sunday's demonstration isn't just about pudding. It's about demonstrating that Germans can work with British, learn from them, build something new. Do that well enough, and maybe you create opportunities for family reunification. Sunday's event was no longer just about food. It was about building bridges that might literally save her family's lives. About proving that former enemies could become valued community members. Sunday arrived with crisp autumn weather. Behind the mess hall, British staff had set up demonstration tables laden with ingredients, steamers and seating for everyone. Helene stood beside Sergeant Major Pemberton as the women filed out, many wrapped in coats against the October chill. Captain Thornhill opened with brief remarks. Ladies, today is about understanding that different cultures solve similar problems in different ways. Food is universal. Methods vary. Helene stepped forward, her breath visible in the cold air. 3 weeks ago, I declared that British puddings were workhouse food, unsuitable for educated women. I was wrong. Wrong because I let pride blind me to truth. She gestured to Pemberton, who began demonstrating the preparation. Watch how she handles the suet. Gentle touch, kept cold. This is the same principle we use for making proper pastry. Respect the ingredients, understand the chemistry. Together, they worked through the demonstration. Pemberton prepared spotted dick, while Helene provided commentary in German, explaining the techniques, drawing parallels to German methods. The steaming process, Helene explained, creates gentle, even heat. This is similar to how we prepare Dampfnudel, just with different ingredients. The principle is identical. Patient cooking develops flavour and texture. As puddings were served with warm custard, transformation unfolded around the tables. First bites brought surprise. Second bites brought acceptance. Third bites brought appreciation. The atmosphere shifted from demonstration to celebration. A young woman named Ilse, who'd been among the most resistant, approached Helene afterward. Frau Hauptmann, I thought if I accepted British food, I was admitting that Germany deserved to lose. But you've shown me that appreciating their cooking doesn't mean rejecting our own. Thank you. Later, Captain Thornhill approached Helene privately. That was exceptional work today, Frau Hauptmann. Helene pulled out Klaus's letter. My brother and his family are starving in Cologne. I want to apply for family reunification. Thornhill read the letter gravely. Your demonstration today will help your case considerably. You've shown adaptability, willingness to learn, respect for British culture. These are exactly the qualities we look for in reunification applications. I'll personally support your request. 6 months later, Helene watched her brother Klaus, his wife Anna, and their 2 daughters taste British treacle pudding for the first time. The girls, hollow-eyed and thin from months of near starvation in Cologne, approached the steaming dessert with desperate hunger. What is this, Tante Helena? Asked young Gisela, the elder daughter. This is what I once called primitive food because I was too proud to taste it properly. Now I call it delicious. Klaus sat beside her, tears streaming down his face as he ate. I cannot believe this is real. Warm food. Sweet food, as much as we want. I know, Helene replied quietly. And that contrast taught me more about which system deserved to survive than any political speech ever could. The British feed even their prisoners, and their prisoners' families better than our government fed its own people in the final years. Anna touched Helene's hand. Klaus wrote that you fought this food at first, that you led resistance against it. I did, Helene admitted. I was wrong about so many things, but I'm grateful I learned to admit it. Young Gisela finished her pudding and looked up with the first genuine smile Helene had seen from her. "May I have more, Tante?" "Yes, Liebling, as much as you want." As Helene watched her family eat, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, from contempt to curiosity, from resistance to acceptance, from pride to humility. The spotted dick she'd mocked had become her teacher, showing her that true strength meant admitting when you were wrong, and that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single, honest spoonful.